In this video, we're going to be looking at the all-seeing eye that's on the back of the $1 bill, and we're going to compare that to the proboscis of a ribbon worm. And we're going to see that it's probably the same thing. So what we're looking at is the reverse seal, which is part of the Great Seal of the United States, and it's an eye floating above a pyramid. And the eye is surrounded by light. Okay, so what we're looking at, of course, is the eye floating above an unfinished pyramid. And let's go to etymonline.com and look up the word pyramid, and it's from Greek. Paramus also meant kind of cake of roasted wheat grains preserved in honey, from pyros, wheat. So you see that pyramid also has a lot to do with food. What I'm showing now is the food pyramid, and the food pyramid, according to Wikipedia, a food pyramid is a representation of the optimal number of servings to be eaten each day from each of the basic food groups. The first pyramid was published in Sweden in 1974. So there's a tremendous connection between the pyramid and wheat and food. And we're going to explore that a little bit with the proboscis worm or the ribbon worm. Okay, so we're going to be looking at pictures of the ribbon worm, also known as the proboscis worm or proboscis worm. And this is part of a species called the Nemertea. And that's what the ribbon worm is a part of. These ribbon worms have what's called a proboscis. And the proboscis will shoot out an exoskeleton from its nose. It'll shoot out this fluid, this milky fluid that's called an exoskeleton. It's made of connective tissue, and it shoots it out of the nose, just like mucus. And I'll show these pictures as you see. What I'm showing now is the proboscis pore of a ribbon worm, and you'll see that it looks very much like the all-seeing eye image when we put it side by side. The all-seeing eye is called the all-seeing eye because if you look inside the proboscis chamber, which is called the rhynchoceal, remember that word. The ribbon worm produces an awl inside its proboscis. And you'll see it looks just like an awl. I'm going to show you this awl, and we're going to compare it with actual tool awls or sewing awls. As we're looking at pictures of awls, it's important to note they call this tool that's inside of the proboscis a stylet. And the stylet is made of calcium phosphate. And when you look up calcium phosphate or phosphate in etymonline, it leads to phosphorus. And phosphorus, it says, substance or organism that shines of itself, light-bringing, also the morning star. This stylet that's inside of the proboscis is shining of phosphorus. When this shining calcium phosphate stylet or awl makes contact with the proboscis pore, it becomes the all-seeing eye of Providence. Can we really be sure that the all-seeing eye is from a ribbon worm? Absolutely. If you're able to get hold of a cast of a femur bone, your left femur bone, or an actual femur bone, and you were to hold a magnifying glass up to the condyles of the femur bone, you're going to see this all-seeing eye image on the bones. Of course, it's going to take a magnifying glass. It's not going to be blatantly obvious that it's there on your knee. If it was, obviously it would have been common knowledge many years ago. But I'm sure this is common knowledge to the Masons or the powers that run our reality. And when you hold that magnifying glass, you're going to see that there's more to the all-seeing eye than just the ribbon worm. There is also a connection with snails. Before we get into the snail connection to the all-seeing eye, I just want to quickly review. So on your left femur, you have a ribbon worm. And this ribbon worm has a proboscis. And inside the proboscis is a stylet. It looks just like an awl. And this awl makes contact with the proboscis pore. And the ribbon worm has a way of shooting out what's called connective tissue, an exoskeleton layer. It looks like mucus, but it's actually connective tissue. And connective tissue is made of mesenchyme. And mesenchyme is stem cells. So it shoots out this mesenchyme out of its proboscis. Another part to this ribbon worm femur bone connection is your kneecap. Now your kneecap articulates with your femur bone. So the kneecap is also called a patella. And when you look up the word patella in Wiktionary, it's going to say limpet snail. That's right, your patella, your kneecaps are snails. And if you don't think you have snails inside of your body, you could look up medical terms for snails. In other words, zinc finger protein is also called snail or snail 1, and that's an important protein inside of us that helps make the stem cells inside of us. So I'm going to blow up an image of a patella that's on Wikipedia, and if you're able to blow it up as large as you can, you're going to see that spiritual images live on our kneecaps. Your femur bone articulates with the patella, and patella is a limpet snail. And the word limpet means lamb rock. In other words, you have lambs or sheep on your knees, and these lambs work with the ribbon worm. One of the big images of the medical industry is the rod of Asclepius. And if you look at the rod of Asclepius, it's on everything, emergency vehicles and medical establishments, and it's also on the back of a limpet snail. And also, if you're able to blow up that image of the patella, you're going to see the rod of Asclepius on the back of the patella, the back of the limpet snail that lives on your kneecap. I'm going to show the inside of a snail's mouth or a limpet snail's mouth, and inside of their mouths, they have something called a radula. And the radula, according to Wikipedia, the radula is an anatomical structure used by mollusks for feeding, sometimes compared to a tongue. It is a minutely toothed chitinous ribbon, which is typically used for scraping or cutting food before the food enters the esophagus. Whenever you look up the word radula, you get ribbon, as in ribbon worm. This radula that you're looking at looks very much like a roll of film, like motion picture film inside a snail's mouth. And this radula works with the odontophore. Now, very briefly, I'll go to Wikipedia. It says the odontophore is part of the feeding mechanism in mollusks. It is the cartilage which underlies and supports the radula, a ribbon of teeth. We now have the radula and we have the snail. And remember, the radula is the ribbon worm. It's very likely the ribbon worm is inside the snail to begin with. And this ribbon worm is transforming. And it creates a bib, this connective tissue that you see the ribbon worm shoot out. It creates a bib on the limpet snail. So this bib is made of mesenchyme. It's stem cells. This pyramid that the all-seeing eye floats above is a bib. It's a food bib. And very interesting word, bib. Remember, it starts the word Bible as bib. And when you look up bib, you're going to see it's related to other things like ties around people's necks and bellwether. Now, bellwether is a bell worn by sheep. What you're looking at is a bellwether. And then you have collar, like priests wear a collar, and a bishop. A bishop is also known as a bite sheep. A bishop. So religions, they wear collars. And in business settings, you wear a tie or an ascot. And you look up cot, and that also has a lot to do with sheep. The terminology used is about this connection between the ribbon worm and the sheep or the snails. It's important to point out that when you're holding a magnifying glass to a femur bone or a cast of a femur bone, you're going to see this net or bib around the snail. And this bib is made of mesenchyme. And if you go and look up mesenchyme, it says mesenchyme is a type of loosely organized animal embryonic connective tissue of undifferentiated cells that give rise to most tissues, and also described as is characterized morphologically by a prominent ground substance matrix. Okay, you go to King James, the King James Bible, and you go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, and it says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." And then Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight." So what I'm saying is this net, this bib around the snail, is actually proof that the Bible actually happens on your kneecap. I'm not saying it didn't happen, in the Middle East. Of course, it probably did, but it also happens as a reminder on our knees. Okay, we're going to look at another Bible verse. That's Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. It says, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." So what the Creator is saying is, Adam is coming out of the ground, and the ground is the substance of the mesenchyme. And again, if you're holding a magnifying glass on your femur bone, you're going to see tiny little people that live on our kneecaps, and these are Bible-related people. Adam and Eve are most likely on our femur bone. For researchers also interested in Hollywood and the secret meanings behind Hollywood movies, you should really start looking at this ribbon worm snail connection. And even the word Hollywood is really another word for ribbon worm. You look up the old word for Hollywood in Ireland, and it was called sanctum nemus. And remember, ribbon worms are part of a species called Nemertea. Nemus and Nemertea are very similar. Also, Hollywood was known as Sanctus boscis. And we're dealing with a proboscis worm. So there is a definite connection between Hollywood and the ribbon worm. It's really the connective tissue that the proboscis worm or the ribbon worm produces that is relatable to Hollywood and all other major productions of our lives. In other words, there is a secret therapy going on in life to graft people into this connective tissue. Okay, we're going to do a bit of review here. And essentially on our kneecaps, we have snails. And inside of these snails, there is a radula, which is a ribbon worm, or a form of a ribbon worm that is transforming inside of this snail. And this is the all-seeing eye. And this ribbon worm or proboscis worm shoots out a thick fluid, a mesenchymal fluid, an exoskeleton out of its proboscis. And it forms a pyramid on the snail, a food pyramid. And if you look up mesenchyme, if you go to a Wiktionary and if you look up chyme, it says the thick semi-fluid mass of partly digested food that is passed from the stomach to the duodenum. The ribbon worm will shoot out this layer of mesenchyme, and it forms a pyramid, and this is where the Bible takes place. This layer of mesenchyme that's on our knees. Little tiny Bible people come to life on the ground, the substance of the ground on our knees. The possibility also of film, actual motion picture film that is being dissolved, is the radula itself. If you look closely, the radula is like a strip of motion picture film, and this strip it gets dissolved inside of the snail. and it becomes like a living fluid. When you look at the real pyramids in Egypt, they're probably made the same way. In other words, we're a connection between a snail and a ribbon worm. And interesting enough, the pyramids in Egypt were made by pharaohs. And pharaoh, I know it's spelled differently, F-A-R-R-O-W, is a pig. Pharaoh is a pig. But the word pig has a lot to do with sheep. And F-A-A-R is sheep. So the sheep, remember, are the snails. We're talking about limpets, which are lamb rocks. The lamb rocks are the snails. And the ribbon worm transforms itself inside of the snail on the rod of Asclepius. Remember, I showed images of the rod of Asclepius. It's on the back of a snail. Interesting enough, when you look at the Great Seal that makes the Great Seal, in other words, the printing press that makes the Great Seal is called the Great Seal. The printing press and the cabinet look just like a snail. We're going to look at a couple of passages in the Bible about worms. So we're going to look at Job chapter 25, verse 6. It says, "How much less man that is a worm, and the Son of Man, which is a worm." Okay, we're going to go down to Isaiah chapter 41, verse 14. It says, "Fear not, thou worm Jacob." So there are very important passages in the Bible regarding worms and men. And that's exactly what's going on underneath. These snails and worms are making human parasites. In other words, another race of beings are living inside of us.